June 7th, 1692. Port Royal, the richest, most sinful city on earth. And in 3 minutes, the wicked city sank, buried by the sea and frozen in time.
June 7th, 1692. 11:43 in the morning. Inside the King's House Tavern on High Street, Port Royal, Jamaica, Reverend Emmanuel Heath was drinking Madeira wine. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of roasted pork. Through the window, he could see the harbor glittering in the tropical sun. 40 ships at anchor. The richest port in the New World. Outside, a woman in a crimson dress haggled with a fence over a stolen pearl necklace. 2 pirates argued over cards. The church bells at St. Paul's began to ring. No one was pulling the ropes. Heath felt the glass tremble in his hand. The wine rippled. Then the floor dropped away beneath him. In 3 minutes, 2/3 of the city would be underwater. 2,000 people would be dead. The ground would literally swallow them alive. The thing that was supposed to save them guaranteed their destruction. Port Royal had been built on sand. Loose, wet, unstable sand deposited over centuries at the tip of the Palisadoes Peninsula. The same protected harbor that made the city rich, shallow, sheltered, perfect for merchant ships and pirate sloops, sat on top of a geological time bomb. When the earthquake hit, the sand would behave like liquid. The entire city would sink into itself. The ground that supported the wickedest city on earth would become its grave. They had built their Babylon on quicksand. They just didn't know it yet. Flashback. The rise of the wickedest city. To understand how this happened, we need to go back 37 years. In 1655, British forces under Admiral William Penn captured Jamaica from the Spanish. Port Royal was nothing then. A small fishing village at the end of a 7-mile sand spit. But the British saw its potential. A natural harbor. Deep enough for warships. Narrow entrance easy to defend. They built Fort Charles. Fort James. Fort Carlisle. They turned the sand spit into a fortress. Then they made a decision that would define the city's character. They invited the pirates. Not officially, of course. The Crown called them privateers. Men with letters of marque authorizing them to attack Spanish shipping. Henry Morgan. Christopher Myngs. Edward Mansfield. Give them a safe harbor, the British reasoned, and they would defend Jamaica from Spanish retaliation. Let them spend their stolen gold in British taverns. Everyone profits. The math was simple. And catastrophically flawed. By 1692, Port Royal had 6,500 inhabitants crammed into 53 acres. More people per square foot than London. 1 person for every 350 square feet. You could walk the entire city in 20 minutes. But you'd pass 40 taverns. Dozens of brothels. Gambling houses. Warehouses stuffed with stolen cargo. Gold coins changing hands in broad daylight. The entire city ran on pirate money. The numbers told the story. 1 tavern for every 162 residents. In London, the ratio was 1 tavern for every 600 residents. Port Royal had more brothels per capita than any city in the Western Hemisphere. The merchant Peter Beckford owned warehouses containing £15,000 in goods, all of it plundered from Spanish ships. The tavern keeper John White made £400 a year. A fortune. In England, a skilled craftsman made £20 a year. The city generated £75,000 in annual trade. Nearly half of it was stolen goods. Port Royal wasn't just tolerating piracy. It was built on piracy. Every brick. Every coin. Every transaction. The entire economy was constructed on theft, violence, and human suffering. The Spanish called it the storehouse of the West Indies. The English called it the richest city in the New World. The clergy called it Sodom. They were all correct. The fatal mistake, building on sand. The mistake wasn't the piracy. The mistake was the foundation. Between 1655 and 1692, the city expanded rapidly. Too rapidly. Builders constructed wharves extending into the harbor. They built on filled land. They used sand and silt to create new ground where the harbor had been. The wealthy merchants wanted waterfront property. The shipbuilders needed direct access to the ships. So they built outward, piling sand and debris into the shallow water, creating artificial land. No one tested the soil. No one considered the geology. They saw calm water and solid-looking ground and built 4-story brick buildings on top of it. The irony was complete. The same shallow harbor that made Port Royal strategically perfect made it geologically doomed. The sand spit had been formed by centuries of wave action depositing sediment. The new land built into the harbor was even worse, loose fill with seawater still flowing through it. When an earthquake hit, the vibrations would cause the sand particles to lose contact with each other. The solid ground would become liquid. The scientific term is liquefaction. The practical term is death trap. By June 7, 1692, the most valuable real estate in Port Royal, the warehouses, the merchant houses, the wharves where ships loaded stolen cargo, sat on ground that wasn't really ground at all. It was wet sand held in place by stillness and luck. The earthquake would remove both. The first cascade, the ground becomes water. June 7, 1692. 11:43 a.m. Magnitude 7.5. The first tremor lasted 3 seconds. Reverend Heath's wine glass shattered on the floor. The oak beams of the king's house groaned. Outside, a woman screamed. Then the second tremor hit. This one didn't stop. The limestone bedrock beneath Jamaica fractured along the Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault. The seismic waves traveled through the island at 4,000 meters per second. When they reached Port Royal's foundation of loose, water-saturated sand, the physics became simple and terrible. The vibrations increased the water pressure in the spaces between sand grains. The sand particles lost contact with each other. The friction that held the ground together vanished. In geological terms, the effective stress became zero. In human terms, the ground became liquid. Louis Galdi, a merchant, was standing on High Street negotiating the price of mahogany lumber. He was 27 years old. He had 3,000 pounds in goods stored in a warehouse on the harbor front. The street beneath him cracked open. He dropped 10 feet into the fissure. The walls of earth closed around him up to his neck. Then another tremor opened the crack wider. He fell through an underground cavity. Water rushed over him. He tumbled through darkness. Then a wave washed him back up through another opening 50 feet away. He survived. Both legs broken. 3 ribs fractured. But alive. 200 other people fell into similar cracks. The earth closed on them. Decapitated them. Their bodies remained trapped, compressed in the ground like archaeological specimens. Geologists would find their skeletons 300 years later, still in the positions they died in, their final expressions preserved in the anaerobic sand. The ground didn't just shake. It ate people. The second cascade. The city slides into the harbor. 11:44 a.m. 1 minute into the earthquake. The waterfront district began to move. The liquefied sand beneath the wharves and warehouses no longer supported any weight. Gravity took over. Entire blocks of the city started sliding toward the harbor. Not collapsing. Sliding. Like a mudslide, but the mud was what used to be solid ground. Fort James went first. The massive stone fortification with walls 12 feet thick. It tilted, slid, and disappeared beneath the harbor. Gone in 30 seconds. The soldiers inside, 17 men, went with it. Their bodies were never recovered. Then the warehouses. Peter Beckford's warehouse containing 15,000 pounds in stolen goods. John White's tavern with 40 customers inside. The merchant Samuel Etheridge's 4-story brick mansion, the finest house in Port Royal, which he had built just 3 years earlier for 2,000 pounds. One by one, they tilted and slid into the water. The people inside didn't have time to escape. They were still trying to understand what was happening when the buildings sank. Some jumped from windows into what used to be streets and landed in water. Some were crushed by collapsing walls. Some were trapped in rooms that became underwater coffins, perfectly preserved for 3 centuries. Captain John Pike was aboard his merchant ship anchored in the harbor. He watched the waterfront disappear. The earth opened and swallowed multitudes of people, he wrote later. The sea came rolling over the land in waves like mountains. 33 acres of land sank beneath the harbor. 2/3 of the city. The ground dropped between 10 and 40 feet. Buildings that had been on dry land were now in 15 feet of water. The change took 90 seconds. The math was brutal. 6,500 people. 2/3 of the city underwater. That put 4,300 people in the disaster zone. The buildings fell. The ground swallowed people. The water rushed in. At least 2,000 died in the first 3 minutes. The third cascade, the wave. 11:45 a.m. 2 minutes into the earthquake. When 33 acres of land suddenly dropped into the harbor, it displaced thousands of tons of water. That water had to go somewhere. It went up. A tsunami wave formed in the harbor. Not a massive wave like the ones that cross oceans. A local wave. 15 to 20 feet high. It hit the remaining parts of Port Royal from behind. The sections of the city that hadn't sunk were now hit by a wall of water. HMS Swan, a warship anchored in the harbor, was lifted by the wave and thrown inland. The ship, weighing 180 tons, carrying 24 guns, was hurled 200 feet and deposited on top of collapsed buildings. The crew survived. They climbed down from their ship, which was now sitting on what used to be High Street, and walked away. The wave carried other things too. Debris from the sunken buildings. Barrels of rum and molasses. Crates of stolen goods. And bodies. Hundreds of bodies. The Palisado Cemetery, built on the same unstable sand as the rest of the city, had cracked open. Coffins floated to the surface. Corpses washed through the streets. Reverend Heath, still alive, climbed onto floating debris. He watched bodies drift past. Some were newly dead, drowned in the earthquake. Some were old corpses from the cemetery, in various stages of decay. The dead and the living floated together, he wrote. I could not tell which was which until they moved. The water that remained after the wave was contaminated with everything Port Royal had to offer. Sewage. Decomposing bodies. Toxic cargo from the warehouses. Mercury from the hat makers. Lead from the pewterers. Alcohol from burst rum barrels. The survivors were swimming in poison. Those who drank the water died within days. The fourth cascade, disease and fire. June 7th, evening. 6 hours after the earthquake. The survivors, roughly 1,500 people, huddled on the remaining land. 1/3 of the city was still above water, but barely. Buildings leaned at crazy angles. Cracks ran through every street. The ground was still unstable, still occasionally trembling with aftershocks. No one knew what to do. The government was gone. Lieutenant Governor John White had survived, but Fort Charles was damaged and Fort James was underwater. The military garrison was scattered. The wealthy merchants who ran the city were dead or had fled. There was no food supply, no clean water, no medical care, no plan. Then the fires started. Overturned lamps. Cooking fires that had scattered during the earthquake. Damaged buildings with exposed timbers. The fires spread through the surviving sections of the city. People ran from collapsing buildings only to face flames. The fire brigade was dead or missing. No one fought the fires. They just burned. The survivors had a choice: stay and risk fire and aftershocks, or flee to the countryside where there was no food or shelter. Most stayed. They looted the dead. They pulled bodies from the water and stripped them of jewelry, coins, anything valuable. The social order had collapsed. The wickedest city on earth became even more wicked in its final hours. Then the disease hit. The contaminated water. The bodies rotting in the sun. The injuries from the earthquake, broken bones, crushed limbs, deep cuts exposed to filthy water. Within 3 days, hundreds were sick. Fever. Dysentery. Infected wounds turning gangrenous. The physician Dr. Emmanuel Heath, the Reverend's brother, tried to treat people, but he had no supplies. No clean bandages. no medicine, no way to prevent infection. The death toll from disease exceeded the death toll from the earthquake. By June 21st, 2 weeks after the earthquake, another 3,000 people were dead. Some from injuries, most from disease. The survivors buried them in mass graves inland. They didn't have time for individual burials. They couldn't even record all the names. The final count, approximately 5,000 dead. 3/4 of the population. Port Royal had destroyed itself. What if? The alternatives that failed. Could anything have saved them? What if they had built on better ground? There was no better ground. The entire Palisadoes Peninsula was sand. Moving the city inland meant abandoning the harbor, the only reason for the city to exist. They could have built on the mainland, but then they would have lost the defensible position that protected them from Spanish attack. What if they had built lighter structures? Would instead of brick? It wouldn't have mattered. The liquefaction affected the ground itself. Wooden buildings would have sunk just as fast. They might have killed fewer people when they collapsed, but the death toll would still have been catastrophic. What if they had predicted the earthquake? Jamaica had earthquakes. Small ones. Tremors. But no one in 1692 understood plate tectonics or fault lines or seismic prediction. They had no way to know the Enriquillo Plantain Garden fault was building pressure. Even if they had known, what could they have done? Abandon the richest city in the New World because of a theoretical threat? The truth was darker. Nothing could have saved them because everything about Port Royal was wrong. Wrong location. Wrong foundation. Wrong construction. Wrong timing. The city existed because of strategic and economic convenience, not geological sense. They built it fast and built it rich and never considered what the ground beneath them actually was. The irony was complete. The same shallow harbor that made Port Royal perfect for ships made it perfect for disaster. The same rapid wealth that let them build a city in 37 years meant they built it wrong. The same pirate gold that made every resident rich meant no one wanted to slow down and do it properly. They were racing toward destruction and everyone was getting rich on the journey. The final moments. June 7, 1692. 11:46 a.m. 3 minutes after the first tremor. John White, the tavern keeper, was trapped in the ruins of his building. He could hear water rushing. He could hear screaming. His leg was pinned under a fallen beam. The building was tilting, sinking into the liquefied ground. He could feel it moving beneath him like a ship in rough seas. The last thing he saw was the mahogany bar he had imported from Honduras 6 months earlier, the bar he had been so proud of, the bar where Henry Morgan himself had drunk rum 10 years before. It slid past him into the water and disappeared. Peter Beckford, the wealthy merchant, made it outside his warehouse just as it collapsed. He ran toward higher ground, but the street cracked open in front of him. He tried to jump the gap. He didn't make it. He fell 20 feet into darkness. The crack closed above him. They found his body in 1959, perfectly preserved, his hands still raised above his head trying to catch the edge. The woman in the crimson dress, whose name no one recorded, was swallowed by the ground on High Street. The two pirates arguing over cards were crushed when the tavern collapsed. The fence buying the pearl necklace drowned when the wave hit. The sailors on the 40 ships in the harbor watched the city sink and could do nothing. Some tried to launch boats to save people. The chaos in the water made rescue impossible. Bodies. Debris. Sharks drawn by the blood. St. Paul's Church, where the bells had rung by themselves, collapsed. The priest, Reverend White, survived by climbing the bell tower just before it fell. He clung to floating wreckage for 6 hours before being rescued. He swore he would never set foot in Port Royal again. He kept that promise. By noon, it was over. The earthquake had stopped. The fires were burning but contained to the surviving sections. The tsunami wave had receded. What was left of Port Royal sat in shock, surrounded by water and bodies and the floating remnants of the richest city in the New World. Louis Galdi, pulled from the water with 2 broken legs, looked at the harbor. Where the waterfront had been, there was now just water. Where Fort James had stood, there was nothing. Where the warehouses had stored 200,000 pounds in goods, there were ripples. "It is all gone," he said. "God has judged us." He was right about the first part. The aftermath, God's judgment. The preachers arrived within days. They came from Kingston, from Spanish Town, from London when they heard the news. They brought pamphlets with titles like God's Judgment on Port Royal and The Destruction of the New Sodom. They preached in the ruins. They said the earthquake was divine retribution for sin, for piracy, for prostitution, for the wickedness that had made Port Royal famous. The survivors believed them. Church attendance in the surviving sections of Port Royal increased 300%. Men who had never prayed publicly began holding prayer meetings. Women who had worked in brothels converted and married sailors. The tavern keeper John Starr, who survived the earthquake, sold his tavern and became a lay preacher. He spent the rest of his life telling people the earthquake was God's punishment. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The earthquake had hit at 11:43 a.m. on a Tuesday. Most people were out in the streets. The taverns were full. Business was being conducted. It was the wickedest city at its wickedest moment. And God had destroyed it in 3 minutes. The religious interpretation became official. The British Crown called it divine judgment. The Church of England produced sermons about Port Royal's fall. It became a morality tale. A warning. This is what happens when you build your city on sin. But there was another irony, deeper and stranger than the religious one. The earthquake didn't destroy Port Royal. It preserved it. 300 years later, the preserved city. The Port Royal that sank in 1692 is still there. 40 feet underwater. Perfectly preserved. When the city sank into the harbor, it was sealed in anaerobic sediment. No oxygen. No bacteria. No decay. The buildings, the goods, the bodies, everything was preserved exactly as it was at 11:46 a.m. on June 7, 1692. Archaeological excavations began in 1959. Edwin Link, an aviation pioneer, used submersibles to explore the sunken city. What he found was astonishing. Entire buildings intact. Walls still standing. Door frames in place. Inside the buildings, pewter plates with food still on them. Wine bottles still sealed. Pocket watches stopped at 11:43. Clay pipes with tobacco still in them. A turtle shell with meat still inside. Someone's lunch interrupted by death. They found the bodies too. Perfectly preserved skeletons in collapsed buildings. A woman with her child. A man with his hands raised above his head. The positions they died in, frozen for 3 centuries. Port Royal became one of the most important archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere. UNESCO protected it. Marine archaeologists called it the Pompeii of the Caribbean. The anaerobic conditions had done what no museum could do, preserved an entire 17th century city in perfect detail. The irony was exquisite. The preachers said God had destroyed Port Royal to wipe out wickedness. But God, or geology, or simple bad luck, had actually preserved it forever. The wickedest city on earth would never be forgotten. It would sit underwater, perfectly intact, a time capsule of piracy and wealth and sin. They had tried to destroy it. They had actually made it immortal. The mathematics of doom. The numbers tell the complete story. June 7, 1692. 11:43 a.m. Port Royal, Jamaica. 53 acres of city. 33 acres sank. 62% of the total area. 6,500 population. 2,000 dead in the earthquake. 3,000 dead from disease. 5,000 total. 77% mortality rate. 180 buildings collapsed. 40 taverns destroyed. 13 ships capsized. £200,000 in property lost. In 1692 pounds. Equivalent to approximately £50 million today. 3 minutes. From the first tremor to the final collapse. 3 minutes to destroy 37 years of growth. The earthquake measured 7.5 on the Richter scale. But the Richter scale wouldn't be invented until 1935. In 1692, they just called it the Judgment. The fault line was the Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault. It runs along the southern coast of Jamaica. It had been building pressure for decades. It released that pressure all at once. The next major earthquake on that fault wouldn't come until 1907. 215 years later. Port Royal had been built on sand deposited over approximately 8,000 years. When the earthquake hit, the sand liquefied in the first 30 seconds. The buildings began sinking within 60 seconds. The city was underwater within 3 minutes. The speed was the killing factor. If the collapse had taken an hour, people could have evacuated. If it had taken even 10 minutes, thousands could have escaped. But 3 minutes? There was no time to process what was happening. No time to grab possessions. No time to say goodbye. Just sudden, immediate destruction. The math was always against them. They just didn't know how to do the calculation. What happened to the survivors? Louis Galdi recovered from his broken legs. He stayed in Jamaica. He became a successful merchant in Spanish Town. He lived to be 71 years old. When he died in 1736, he had a tombstone carved with his story: swallowed up by the great earthquake, by the providence of God was cast into the sea and miraculously saved by swimming. The tombstone still exists. Tourists visit it. The story of the man who fell through the earth and survived became legend. Reverend Emmanuel Heath returned to England. He spent the rest of his life telling the story of Port Royal. He wrote extensively about the earthquake. His accounts are the most detailed eyewitness testimony we have. He never stopped calling it God's judgment. Captain John Pike continued sailing. He transported survivors from Port Royal to other Caribbean islands. He wrote a detailed account of watching the city sink. His report was published in London and made him briefly famous. He died in 1704, probably of yellow fever, in Charleston. Henry Morgan, the most famous pirate associated with Port Royal, had been dead for 4 years when the earthquake hit. He had died on August 25, 1688, at his estate outside Port Royal. He was 53 years old. Alcoholism and dropsy. He was buried with full honors in the Palisados Cemetery. His grave washed into the sea during the earthquake. His coffin was never recovered. The grave marker disappeared. The most famous privateer in Jamaica was dumped into the harbor with everyone else. Even dead for 4 years, he couldn't escape the pirate's fate. The end of an era. Port Royal never recovered. The surviving residents rebuilt some sections of the city. But the wealth was gone. The warehouses were underwater. The merchants were dead or had moved. The pirates stopped coming. Why anchor at a destroyed city when there were safer harbors available? The British moved the capital to Spanish Town, inland, on solid ground. Port Royal remained a minor naval base, but the Golden Age was over. By 1700, the population was barely 2,000. By 1750, it was a backwater. The Golden Age of piracy would continue for another 30 years. Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Bonnie. But they operated from Nassau, from the Carolinas, from Madagascar. Not from Port Royal. The earthquake had destroyed more than a city. It had destroyed the pirate economy's center of gravity. The message was clear to everyone. This is what happens when you build your empire on theft and sin and unstable ground. This is what happens when you choose wealth over wisdom. This is what happens when you ignore the foundation in your rush to build higher. The preachers were right about one thing. Port Royal was a warning. Just not the warning they thought it was. Epilogue. The bells still ring. There's a legend in Jamaica. People say that if you dive to the ruins of Port Royal, if you go down in the early morning when the water is calm, you can hear the church bells ringing. The bells of St. Paul's Church, ringing themselves in the earthquake. Still ringing, 3 centuries later. It's not true, of course. The bells are long gone, buried in sediment or carried away by currents. But the legend persists because people want it to be true. They want the city to still be there, still alive somehow, still warning people. In a sense, it is. Port Royal sits 40 feet underwater, perfectly preserved, a snapshot of June 7, 1692, frozen in sediment. Archaeologists still dive there. They still find artifacts, coins, pottery, tools, bodies. Every expedition brings up new evidence of the city that was. The site attracts tourists, divers, historians, people who want to see the wickedest city on earth, or what's left of it. They look down through the clear Caribbean water and see the ruins. Walls, foundations, streets. A city that exists but doesn't exist. Present but absent. Destroyed but preserved. The perfect metaphor for everything Port Royal was. A city built on theft that became a treasure. A den of sin that became a moral lesson. A geological disaster that became an archaeological miracle. A 3-minute tragedy that will last forever. They never had a chance. June 7, 1692. 11:43 a.m. Before the first tremor. Louis Galdi is negotiating the price of mahogany. Peter Beckford is checking his warehouse inventory. John White is serving rum in his tavern. The woman in the crimson dress is haggling over a pearl necklace. Reverend Heath is drinking Madeira and watching the harbor. They have 3 minutes to live. They don't know it. But the ground beneath them knows. The sand is ready. The water pressure is waiting. The fault line has been building toward this moment for decades. The physics is already decided. The mathematics is already done. Nothing they can do will change what happens next. No prayer. No preparation. No escape plan. The city is built on sand and the earthquake is coming, and those two facts add up to only one conclusion. They were doomed from the moment they built the first building on the sand spit. They were doomed when they chose wealth over safety. They were doomed when they built their city on the profits of theft and called it prosperity. They were doomed when they ignored what they were building on because they were too focused on what they were building. The ground beneath Port Royal was never solid. It was always temporary. Always unstable. Always waiting for the right moment to become what it truly was. Water pretending to be earth. Every building they constructed made it worse. Every new wharf extended into weaker ground. Every ton of brick and stone added weight to a foundation that couldn't hold it. They were building their own trap, one building at a time, one merchant house at a time, one fortune at a time. The equation was simple. Sand plus water plus weight plus earthquake equals liquefaction. Liquefaction equals collapse. Collapse equals death. They couldn't see the equation. They only saw the gold. By 11:43 a.m. on June 7, 1692, every factor was in place. The city was at maximum size. The ground was at maximum saturation. The fault line was at maximum pressure. The mathematics was complete. All that was needed was the trigger. The earthquake provided it. And Port Royal, the richest city in the New World, the wickedest city on earth, the jewel of the Caribbean, the storehouse of the West Indies, Port Royal sank into the harbor in 3 minutes. They were doomed from June 7, 1655, when the British decided to build a city on a sand spit. They just didn't know it yet.